Literally thousands of quote-unquote history channels talk about the MG42 and chew over the same few facts about it. They focus mostly on its high rate of fire, but completely overlook just how deeply it actually affected Allied commanders when it appeared in the war, or how they tried to copy it and use it themselves. The Germans introduced a completely new concept to the world, and strangely enough, it still lasts to this day, over 80 years later, with the very same weapon in service. Okay, so let's go all the way from the beginning, so everything will make sense. After the First World War, machine guns showed just how they could change warfare, and they were obviously there to stay. However, the Germans had two problems in the years after the First and before the Second World War. The first was that they were banned from developing weapons because they got blamed for the First World War, and they lost it. But this was not much of an issue because they were doing it anyway, just under code names and using firms outside Germany where, in theory, restrictions were not applied. The next thing was that they envisioned a new tactic of fighting instead of the bloody stalemate of trenches that characterized the Western Front. They wanted something light and mobile for the Blitzkrieg, and old water-cooled Maxim-type machine guns, like the German MG08, simply were not fitting that picture. They were operated by a crew of at least 5 and weighed over 100 pounds with water, tripod, and all the things they needed to operate. So, in complete secrecy, the Germans began their journey towards the legendary MG42. The first air-cooled light machine gun versions they came up with, like the MG13, were magazine-fed and held only 25 rounds, which gave them just about 2 seconds of continuous fire, or they used 75-round drums that were unreliable. So they pressed further to create a really modern machine gun, but not just any machine gun. The Germans wanted what is today well known as the general-purpose machine gun concept. They wanted one good weapon that could work in multiple different configurations and be mounted on anything from vehicles, tanks and planes, and even used against low-flying aircraft, mounted in light or heavy configuration, all with just one machine gun. And they made it. I am talking here, of course, about the often overlooked MG34, the predecessor of the soon-to-come MG42. Now, why is this important? Well, the thing is that the MG34 was the world's first general-purpose machine gun with reliable and quite smart belt feeding and a quick barrel change system. When it appeared for the first time on the battlefield in the Spanish Civil War, which the Germans used to test their new weapons, no one in the world had anything remotely close to such a weapon. But the Germans still were not satisfied enough and ordered their engineers to come up with something even better, but also to make it significantly cheaper and faster for mass production. You see, the MG34 was a quality-made, delicate machine. It was built from milled steel parts with tight tolerances that required skilled labor, about 150 man-hours just per single unit, and it was not cheap. Those tight tolerances made it unreliable in the field in dirty or freezing conditions if it was not diligently taken care of. But most importantly, the problem was cost and ease of production. Once the war had turned into a war of attrition, meaning the outcome depended on which side could outproduce the other and sustain battle losses for longer. This was the main reason behind introducing yet another revolutionary machine gun that changed the world so much. And you are now going to see why. Now, German engineers actually reached those seemingly impossible requirements and created an even better machine gun, and also cut the cost and time of production in half. That was how the MG42 was born. Everything that could be was made from stamped sheet metal, which cut the production cost significantly. It now used a short recoil, roller-locked action that allowed a higher rate of fire, and because of looser tolerances, it worked better in realistic battlefield conditions than its older brother. So basically, the MG42 was cheap and quick to produce, robust, simple, and had an extreme rate of fire for machine guns even of today, let alone of that time when it appeared in World War II. The best the Allies had in machine guns fired about 600 rounds per minute, while the MG42 had at least double that, with this rate of fire depending on the ammo and bolt, often reaching 1,500 rounds per minute. It also introduced a simpler and faster, quick barrel change system. Instead of unlatching and twisting the receiver and stock, then extracting the barrel from behind, like in the MG34, the 42 would do this from the side, with a simple latch that would unhook the barrel, and the operator could pull it out with one hand, then slap a fresh one in and continue firing. A well-trained gunner with his assistant could do this in about 4 seconds. But the downside is that because of 20 rounds going through the barrel per second, he had only a couple of seconds of firing time before he risked overheating his machine gun. An interesting thing we could mention here is that the MG34 was the only machine gun the Germans used in their tanks as a hull or coaxial machine gun, just because of this difference in barrel change system. If they wanted to make the MG42 work inside a tank, they would have had to completely redesign the interior, so they stuck with the 34, producing it in parallel until the end of the war. So, going back to the MG42 and why the Americans tried to copy it but could not. The MG42 appeared on the battlefield for the first time on the Eastern Front in late 1941, where it was actually field tested before being pushed into mass production. The Germans liked what they saw in the field, so it was officially adopted into service in early 1942, and the first full-scale combat deployment was in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was not long before panicked reports of Germany's new superior machine gun started rolling into Allied intelligence. The British 8th Army encountered it during battles in North Africa and immediately took notice of that new, distinctive firing sound that did not sound anything like other machine guns of the time. The extremely high rate of fire made it almost a single sound, so it led to those chewed-over nicknames like Hitler's buzzsaw and similar. But surely for Allied soldiers, it was not anything they would laugh about when they were on the receiving end of this, what they called, burp gun. While German soldiers were more than happy with their new machine guns, the Allies had to make propaganda movies to calm down their outgunned soldiers, trying to mock the effectiveness of the MG42 and painting the picture of it barking more than it could bite. They claimed that the lower rate of fire of Allied weapons was actually much more controllable and accurate, and, because of it, more effective, while German machine guns supposedly just wasted ammunition and focused bullets on a very small area because of such a high rate of fire. But try selling that to someone who was under MG42 fire, because it was actually everything opposite to what they were saying, especially if it was used with the Lafette tripod, which we will mention later. So while they were trying to calm and reassure their soldiers, the Allies actually scrambled to put their hands on this new weapon and make it work for them. An even bigger problem was that the Germans organized their squads completely differently. They structured everything around the machine gun to make the best use of its firepower. A standard infantry squad of 10 men consisted of a 3-man machine gun team, gunner, assistant and ammo bearer, 1 officer, and 6 riflemen with Kar-98 rifles. Riflemen made sure that the machine gun team was protected, while it served as the squad's main source of firepower in both defense and offense. Squads were even issued a donkey, or a horse with a cart to carry the ammo, which was not quite light, and the Germans even had ingeniously designed ammo cans. Unlike Allied ammo cans, these were well thought through, watertight, with neat folding handles positioned so 2 cans could be carried in one hand, but also folded to save space inside tanks, for example. A single soldier could, in an emergency, sprint out and come back with 4 250-round cans. Try doing that with American cans without breaking your legs. Finally, some intact MG42s were captured with ammo in North Africa, Sicily and the Eastern Front, and they were immediately sent to Allied labs to begin detailed testing. In February 1943, the US Aberdeen Proving Ground now had almost all details on this gun, and they were fascinated by how technologically advanced it was. In fact, they liked it so much that they now started a program to copy it and make it work in their .30-06 caliber. This led to the creation of the T-24, which essentially was the closest to the original MG42 the Americans could build, just rechambered in their caliber. Using or directly copying the original MG42s would not be so effective because they would have had to also introduce another caliber that would complicate production and supply for the American Army. However, already from the start, problems began to emerge. Although the T-24 had a working mechanism exactly the same as the MG42, American engineers were ordered to try to slightly lower the rate of fire to somewhere around 800 rounds per minute to be more controllable and not waste as much ammunition. So they put in about a twice as heavy bolt and a stiffer return spring, which introduced new issues. The .30-06 is 7.62 by 63 mm, whereas the MG42 was chambered in the German 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge. So you see that the American cartridge is about a 1/4 inch longer with a slightly smaller caliber. This seemingly small difference actually had big consequences when it came to feeding and extraction during firing. When the first T-24 prototype was tested, it failed almost immediately, firing just 1 round and then jamming, failing to eject the spent case. So they cleared it manually and fired again. But the same thing happened. Essentially, they had a single-shot MG42 now. So the second prototype was built that could actually fire fully automatic. However, it also suffered horribly from frequent ejection and feeding failures. Out of 1,500 rounds fired during the testing, it had 51 malfunctions. And also, it had a rate of fire of only about 600 rounds per minute, which was the same rate they already had in their machine guns. The extremely heavy bolt reduced the cycling speed too much, and also added a significant increase in recoiling mass that would break parts of the gun after just a couple of hundred rounds fired. American engineers tried really hard to make this otherwise great machine gun copy work, but in March 1944 they finally gave up and decided to put a pause on the project and focus more on production of the machine guns they were already familiar with. The root of the problems was deemed the 30-06 cartridge that was simply too long for the original MG42 design. So making it work in this caliber would require more than simple rechambering with a new barrel, basically building the gun completely from the ground up, which in itself killed off the idea of simply copying a better German design and quickly fielding it to level the playing field in firepower. The American military continued pushing what already worked, focusing on the improved M1919 with a buttstock and bipod, and the BAR to serve as the squad's boost of firepower. They also had an enormous number of M2 Browning, the legendary 50 calibers, that were too heavy for standard infantry use, but were mounted on literally everything that had tracks, wheels, wings, and even on boats. They made quite a few headaches for German soldiers, who hated the destructive power of the 50 BMG cartridge, and in the later stages of the war, they were literally everywhere on the battlefield. However, this failure to directly copy the MG42 did not mean Americans would not use its elements that were much better than those in their machine guns. In the 1950s, after the war had ended, they were evaluating the whole concept of the general-purpose machine gun and realized that the Germans were right. It is much better to have one good weapon and then make it work in every role than making every single separate one like light, medium, and heavy machine guns, each with separate systems or calibers. So they took notice of the German FG42, which is called the paratroop rifle. They saw its quite good ergonomics and compact size, a better gas system for the new NATO 7.62 by 51 round, and decided to merge it with the MG42 belt feeding system and quick barrel change system. With some mixing of American sprinkles, this eventually created the M60 machine gun that would become famous during the Vietnam War. Although early versions were not too reliable, and the barrel change system worked more in theory than in practice, over time they ironed out all the problems, and later versions of the M60 were quite solid general-purpose machine guns. They were mounted extensively on jeeps, trucks, armored vehicles, and even helicopters and boats in all sorts of configurations and field modifications. It had about half the rate of fire of the MG42, but the feeding system was directly inspired by the MG42, while ergonomics and the gas system, as we said, came from the FG42, along with other modifications engineers made. Now, the real twist in the story of the MG42 actually happens after the war for which it was created. You all know how it ended for the Germans and all that. So they were once again in the years after the war basically forbidden to have an army. But that changed with the NATO alliance. You see, after the war, Americans were not the only ones trying to copy or use existing captured stockpiles of this incredibly effective machine gun. For example, Yugoslavia created one of the best direct copies of the MG42 in the original caliber, just lowering the rate of fire a bit and renaming it M53. They mass-produced it and adopted it for their army, and it remained in service for decades. But the biggest adopter of the MG42 after the war, and the ones who still use them to this day, is no other than Germany. Again. In the 1950s, the newly formed NATO alliance allowed West Germany, under their control, to rearm and form a new army, now as their ally. So the Germans took a look at the most modern machine guns at the time and realized that they already had something much better and were already familiar with it. They took the proven MG42 design and re-engineered it for the new NATO standard caliber, 7.62 by 51, although they also continued production of original MG42s in the original caliber. Because technical drawings for the MG42 were seized by the Soviets at the end of the war, the German company Rheinmetall actually had to reverse engineer and effectively copy their own machine gun. This modernization of the MG42 led to the creation of the MG3. Besides the new NATO caliber, the MG3 came with some fine-tuning for more modern combat, like mounts for vehicles and slightly improved metallurgy and finish. But it retained the extremely high rate of fire and actually was issued with two bolt types of different weight. The standard one gave the original rate of fire of about 1,200 rounds per minute, but if needed, a heavier bolt could be mounted instead that reduced the rate to about 800 rounds per minute. And this could be simply done with no changes in the operating system, just by swapping the bolt and letting the weight difference do the job, so soldiers could tune their weapon for how they liked it more. But we also mentioned the Lafette tripod earlier, and this is, if you ask me, perhaps the most interesting feature of German machine guns that unlocked their full potential. And it is also carried on with the MG3. But the modern Feld Lafette, although keeping the mount for optics, for some reason did not retain the most ingenious feature. So this tripod turned the same machine gun from a light to a heavy configuration, and it worked both with the MG34 and 42. The gun was mounted on it and could be used with optics. It had buffer springs that absorbed recoil and made the gun very stable and accurate, even at long range. The trigger was built into the mount, and the gunner fired without holding the gun itself, so vibrations would not affect the aim. It could even be used for indirect fire, something like very light artillery for area denial. However, the deadliest feature it had was the device called the Tiefenfeuer Automat, which means something like automatic search fire mechanism. It was basically an analog computer, something like a mechanical clock, where the crew could preset firing zones by locking in elevation limits. Once those were set, the mount would slowly shift the gun's aim up and down in a preset arc as it fired. That meant, when the gunner pulled the trigger, the MG would automatically sweep across a kill zone, walking the bursts through an entire slope or a stretch of road without needing to touch the controls. With this mount, the gun was also much lower to the ground, and the gunner could even fire through a periscope sight while staying behind cover. That made it much harder to spot the position, and obviously harder to knock it out. The Germans sometimes used this to create chaos and confusion on the battlefield by positioning the machine gun and tying a string to the trigger of the mount. They would then fire it remotely from cover without even being there, and the gun would sweep across the kill zone as long as it had ammo. The MG42 had changed the world of machine guns so deeply that almost every general-purpose machine gun after World War II incorporated some inspiration or another from it. The MG3 is today still in service with over 30 countries, usually mounted on tanks and vehicles with new fire control platforms to really use the full potential of its high rate of fire. Perhaps when aliens invade us with their laser weapons, we will still be firing long bursts from MG42 versions at them.